Hello, and welcome to The Other Side of Lucy Letby, a podcast that looks at the medical and scientific evidence used to convict the neonatal nurse of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. In episode 10, we're going to finish off PBN. This is where we reach high Farce. We'll just cover the evidence of the last two expert witnesses, Professor Kinsey, who is a hematologist. Hematologists are people who deal with anything to do with the blood, not anything to do with the circulation necessarily. So the content of the blood and the circulation of the blood are two entirely different things. So we're going to look and see what Professor Kinsey has to bring to the party. Professor Kinsey presumably given evidence because they have the mother's antiphospholipid syndrome. So hematologists would sometimes treat people with antiphospholipid syndrome because of the clotting disorders. We're going to look at the evidence given by Dr. Marnarides. And Dr. Marnarides is a pathologist. The consultant was approached by Cheshire Police in late 2017. That would be not long after Dr. Jerram went to the police, not long after Dr. Evans got involved with the police, invited himself into Operation Hummingbird. So he was approached by Cheshire Police to review the deaths of a number of babies at the hospital. He gave his opinion on their causes of death after having reviewed the pathological evidence. I presume again that's the official postmortem carried out on behalf of the coroner and the family. Reviewed the evidence information received from clinical and radiological reviews. Dr. Marnarides said it appeared baby A, a twin boy, died as a result of injection of air into the bloodstream. It would be really interesting to know why a pathologist would say it would appear that way. You can't prove through tissue samples of lung or anywhere else that what you're looking at is an embolism. It's not possible. He reviewed tissue samples from BBS, so these are our tissue samples. This is from Dan O'Donoghue's Twitter feed, 29th of the 3rd, 23. The medic says from his review he found globules, right, in the lungs and brain tissue that were most likely are, well, it's not possible to say if there are unless you do gas chromatography. Gas chromatography is a very sophisticated method to tell exactly what the chemical composition of any gas that you can evaporate or any liquid that you can evaporate, or indeed even insulin. As he said, I cannot be 100% sure. I can't be sure, in other words. But most likely the air went there while the baby was still alive. Dr. Marnarides said, in his opinion, there was no evidence that a natural disease would explain this death, and concluded that death was explicable on the basis of air embolism. So let's look now when Mr. Myers cross-examines this guy. Mr. Myers is now taking the medic back over the cases he has reviewed, starting with BBA. Mr. Myers quotes his review, in which Dr. Marnarides said the cause of death was unascertained and there was no convincing indication the death was due to an unnatural cause. So that was the first report that he wrote in 2017. And then that gets changed to, I can't be 100% sure, but I'm saying that our embolism did it. What caused this 180-degree turn? No convincing indication the death was due to an unnatural cause. So how do we get from there? He says that it's because of globules in the veins and the lungs. But really, without gas chromatography, we cannot know the composition of these globules. So let's look at Science Direct. So what is an embolism? Embolisms are particulate fluid or gaseous materials carried by the bloodstream from the site of their origin or entry into the circulation to other parts of the body. Emboli are classified according to the material from which they're formed. Classifications are thromboemboli, which would be clot embolisms, gas embolism, fat embolism, bone marrow embolism, tumour embolism, cholesterol embolism, foreign body embolism, and amniotic fluid embolism. Then you can get septic thromboemboli. So septic thromboemboli results from infected thrombi. So even Dr. Marnarides himself said he couldn't be 100% sure. But I would like to know, even if, again, even if it was an embolism, how did Dr. Marner really know where the embolism came from? Did the embolism come from the Letby needle? Did it come from CPR, which was extensive in this case? Did it come from ventilation, which happened in this case? Or did it come from one or two venous catheters? If an embolism comes from any of those things, it's going to produce exactly the same post-mortem find. So the best that I think that this guy can say is that he thinks it was an embolism and it could have been caused by one of four things, and there is no way of telling which of them caused it. We're all saying that Lucy Letby did it, so we have many experts saying that Lucy Letby did it. That means it's more likely Lucy Letby did it. It certainly doesn't. Just let's of Newton's theory of gravity. You don't have to know what Newton's theory of gravity is or what it does or what it means. Newton's theory of gravity was the theory by which objects fell to Earth and planets moved around each other in space, etc., for 400 years, until it was replaced by Einstein's theory of relativity. So for 400 years, every expert in the world believed that that's how gravity worked, until science proved that it wasn't how gravity worked. And that's how science worked. So you can have 1 million people having a consensus, and it means absolutely nothing when it comes to the truth. But what I find quite disturbing is the fact that when he was first asked in 2017 to give an opinion on why BBA had died, he agreed with the original pathologist that he had no convincing evidence that BBA died of anything other than natural causes. I find that weird. And then to use globules alone in the lungs and brain without gas chromatography to tell you what was actually in the globule is not really forensic medicine, in my opinion. There we have it. So we'll just have a quick look as well here at Professor Sally Kinsey. Professor Sally Kinsey is a blood expert, that's a hematologist that looks at white cells, red cells, platelets, the lymphatic system, etc., all these different parts of the diseases that come from that. And she confirmed that she was approached by Cheshire Police to look at several cases in the course of the trial. She's written reports for each case and set out the relevant backgrounds for each case the court hears. Her first report for BBA was March 4, 2020. The court hears the conditions of BBA and BB's mother had before her birth, that's the antiphospholipid syndrome. The events of BBA's treatment at the Countess of Chester Hospital neonatal unit, subsequent collapse and death are relayed to the court. So that's their version of it. BBA's blood count was considered normal for his age. Fine. She said that she'd considered whether BBA's mother's autoimmune disease could have been a significant factor in the death of BBA. The autoimmune disease is a rare disorder affecting 50 in 100,000 people. Well, it doesn't matter how rare it is, it affected this mother. So it had a 100% incidence for this mother. And it affects the mother, it can increase blood clotting, etc. And it's all well recognised, yes, so it is. So she reached the same conclusion that the original pathologist reached, that the antiphospholipid syndrome wasn't a direct cause for BBA's death, but it would have been a contributing cause because it caused the premature delivery and the lack of intrauterine growth in the baby, and that would have contributed to the death, but not directly did it cause it. So as far as I'm concerned, that is the end of the usefulness of a hematologist in evidence for BBA. But Mr. Johnson goes on, of course, and he says that there was no concern that the condition had passed from the mother to son, but says Professor Kinsey is sure it did not. There was a concern, it didn't. So that's fine. Professor Kinsey says now, for the conclusion of an embolus for BBA, the doctor's description of skin discoloration in the baby had cemented her concern. So Dr. Kinsey gets on to the embolism bandwagon with the doctor's descriptions of skin discoloration. But we should remind ourselves that the doctor's description of the skin discoloration was pale, poor peripheral perfusion. And that's what the doctors recorded at the time. 2 years later, in an interview, as we now know, with the police, a pink flitting rash was added, but it was not added at the time that the pink flitting rash supposedly took place. We also know from what we've said that pink flitting rashes and all this nonsense about the skin colour and mottling are not connected to air embolism. They are, if anything, connected to shock from poor circulation caused by any problem that could result in baby's death. So her idea being cemented by the presence of this description of skin discoloration wasn't actually there at the time of death is something I find really hard to understand. She added it was rare, the skin embolism was rare, and she had never seen it. So she adds to the sum total for all of our experience. Dr. Evans hasn't seen it. Dr. Bowen has seen one decades ago, but can't remember anything about it apart from the striking X-ray. And Dr. Kinsey, or Professor Kinsey, has never seen one either. But she still said that the discolorations were a stark feature, even though she'd never seen it before. And she said that she was sure it was the cause of death. So that should be the end of Professor Kinsey's contribution to the expert panel here. She's exhausted her expertise by giving an hematological opinion. So we move on to Ben Myers, which is really interesting. For Letby's defense, he's now asking Professor Kinsey questions. He says his questions are more concerned on the nature of an air embolus. So he's talking about the nature of an air embolus. Mr. Myers asked about the principle of experts giving evidence and their areas of expertise. He refers to Professor Kinsey's expertise in hematology and certain pediatric specialisms. They include focus on cancers and blood disorders, so cancers and lymphomas and leukemias, that type of thing. Mr. Myers then says, air embolism does not feature in your expertise, does it? And Professor Kinsey says no. So why is Professor Kinsey giving evidence for something that does not feature in her expertise? And I think this is one of the criticisms of this trial. It's one of the criticisms in general of expert witnesses, that they are supposed to stick to what they know and not to speculate away on things they don't know. I'm actually very pleased that Professor Kinsey said no, that she wasn't an expert in her embolism, because neither am I. So her opinion is really no different than mine. Mr. Myers refers to the diagram of gas exchange, which was standard images in the way gas exchange works in the body. So by gas exchange then mean oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. How it gets in, how it gets out. Professor Kinsey has provided these diagrams for whatever reason I don't know, because they're nothing to do with hematology. Mr. Myers, in no way are they designed to explain an air embolism. Professor Kinsey, they were produced to explain the exchange of gases and circulation. Well, yeah, that's what they were produced to explain, not air embolisms. Mr. Myers, what you are doing in your evidence is to take that understanding of circulation and gas exchange and use it to explain how an air embolus is displayed. Professor Kinsey says yes. Now, Professor Kinsey, he's not an expert, says yes. Mr. Myers says Professor Kinsey has at times commented on the issues of air embolism in her reports for BB, B and D. Professor Kinsey, only in the changes of the skin, very impactful. Well, how is it impactful? She wasn't there, and it was so unimpactful, in fact, that no one who was there for the case of BBA actually recorded it at all. So how can you say something that you don't record or make any mention of in any subsequent official review of the death of BBA was impact? You tell me. Mr. Myers refers to the summary opinion for BBA and whether there were any hematological significance for BBA, and he says that's not in dispute. Neither is it. He refers to his conclusion that he says relies on comments from medical experts Dewey Evans and Dr. Bowen, and the description from Countess at Chester Hospital consultant Dr. Ravi Jayaram of skin discoloration of BBA. Mr. Myers refers to the 1989 Medical Journal review, back to the old 1989 paper, mentioning a particular case, blanching and migrating areas of cutaneous pallor were noted in several cases, and in one of our own cases we know that bright pink vessels against the generally cyanose background. Here we go again. Professor Kinsey confirms she is drawing a parallel between the 1989 journal review and what had been observed by doctors and nurses. We're talking about BBA here. What was observed by doctors and nurses? The flitting pink rash was not observed by doctors and nurses because they didn't record it. She tells the court that she was shocked by Dr. Jairam's description of skin discoloration for BBA, which she said came before she had considered the possibility of an embolism. Here we go again with this, I came across this paper, Dr. Jairam came across this paper, Dr. Evans came across this paper. I came across his description of this thing before I read the paper. But what difference does it make whether you came across the description of Dr. Jairam before you read the paper? You've just said that the paper influenced your opinion. You read that Dr. Jairam saw a pink flaring rash. You read that Dr. Shuley saw a pink flaring rash, and both of them therefore meant that it was our embolism. We have to remind ourselves again, Shuley's paper was about babies that were on massively high pressures that were blasting huge quantities of air and oxygen into the lungs of babies that was subsequently being shunted straight into the body, frothing out and bubbling out through catheters in the body and measured by specific devices, very high levels of oxygen in the circulation. In no way can these two things, that scenario and the scenario of a 5 ml bolus of air, be compared. They cannot be compared because they are not the same. And she goes on to say she knew what an air embolism was like. She knew from her own education before seeing that the description matched what that was said in the 1989 Medical Journal Review. Mr. Myers says Dr. Jairam's clinical note, legs noted to look very white and pale before cardiac arrest. So this is before cardiac arrest. Dr. Jairam was not present before cardiac arrest. Legs noted to look very white and pale before cardiac arrest is something that Dr. Jairam was told. It was not something that he's seen, and therefore it is not an observation of his. But Myers goes on that it does not contain the full detail of her report. Dr. Jairam did not add anything further to the skin discolour observations in the report to the coroner, Mr. Myers asked. So we're back onto this again. Mr. Myers, the description that you read came from his statement to police 2.5 years later. And Professor Kinsey agrees. So it's not an observation. It's a memory. It's a memory that occurred after he read a paper. Professor Kinsey is drawing parallels from that paper, although Dr. Jairam said he didn't. The clinical note of widespread purple discoloration with white patches for baby B was made at the time and is shown to the court, along with a subsequent improvement in skin perfusion. A doctor's note on June the 10th shown to the court, sudden purple blotching all over the body. Upon my arrival, purple blotching discoloration almost resolved. So when the perfusion improves, the purple blotching goes away. The purple blotching, therefore, is indicative of poor perfusion, and we know that is the case. Lucy Letby's note of June 10th is also shown to the court. Cyanosed in appearance, that means the optical illusion of blue, colour changed rapidly to purple blotchiness with white patches. And remember, blue and red give you purple, so that's how the eye sees it. So we've got blue, the cyanotic appearance, and red, the blood's natural appearance, giving you purple with white patches, and the white patches are where no circulation is occurring. We're talking about baby B here, and Lucy Letby's note of June 10th is also shown to the court. Cyanosed in appearance, colour changed rapidly to purple blotchiness. So blotchiness just means unevenly observed on the skin. Purple means a mixture of blue, which is an optical illusion, and red. And then with white patches, the white patches mean areas of the skin for which there is no circulation. So there's the explanation of cyanosed appearance with purple blotches. Neither of the descriptions for baby A or baby B is there any description of a bright pink or red feature. Professor Kinsey, no. So no. Professor Kinsey's report dated November 1st, 2022 is referred to. Mr. Myers said Professor Kinsey was asked to give further consideration as to how an air embolism worked. She was asked to give further evidence on the features of an air embolism, and she's just admitted that she's not an expert on air embolism. She said she was not an expert in such mechanism. That provided the explanation. Well, she didn't provide a very good explanation, I don't think. I think she provided a pretty awful explanation. She didn't look at the origins, the etiology, the epidemiology, any of these things about our embolisms. She just gave our embolisms look like what Dr. Lee said in his paper. And subsequently, we know in the appeal that Dr. Shue poured cold water on all this stuff and said that they'd taken his paper out of context and it wasn't what he meant and what they were saying and what they said. The scene did not prove our embolisms. So he's basically saying this, to a large extent, what I'm saying now. Mr. Myers, you have used your knowledge of blood and circulation to assist this. Professor Kinsey, yes. Mr. Myers says part of the limited medical literature relates to decompression in deep-sea divers, colloquially known as the bend. We're in so much farce territory here now. We're talking about the bend. And this is stunning stuff. We go from neonatal resuscitation, CPR and RDS and all that stuff to the bend. And that in those circumstances, he says, regarding the bend, in those circumstances, nitrogen bubbles would be in the circulation longer than oxygen bubbles. He asked Professor Kinsey if that is the case. Farce notches up a level here. Professor Kinsey, I don't know the answer to that question. So Professor Kinsey doesn't know if nitrogen would be in the circulation longer than oxygen bubbles. And just given evidence on the bends and our embolism. So let's just make it easy, Professor Kinsey, and we'll do a really simple thought experiment. We'll pretend that instead of carbon dioxide that's used to make fizzy water, nitrogen is used to make fizzy water. When the top is on the fizzy water before the bottle is opened, the gas inside the bottle is under pressure and you can't see the bubbles. You take the top off it, the pressure drops because you've opened it to the atmosphere, and the bubbles start appearing. And that's exactly what happens to nitrogen in the bend. So it would be in circulation longer because nitrogen is much less soluble than oxygen. So it requires a lot of pressure to put it into solution. And when you remove that pressure by surfacing, it starts to come out of circulation. And when it comes out of circulation, it gets into joints and different parts of the body and can be quite fatal because it's creating little mini embolisms that can grow into a big embolism. Professor Kinsey doesn't know this. Mr. Myers says the research paper in question for the bends dealt with 4 overweight deep-sea diving adults. So we're now moved from preterm neonates to overweight adults that are deep-sea diving, and this is supposed to be expert evidence in a murder trial. And not a Monty Python sketch. But it does seem like a Monty Python sketch to me. Professor Kinsey, yes, there are many limitations to their findings. So that's why I used the paper. It's just farce upon farce. Mr. Myers said the results were very specific based on the people in the study. So the overweight adults. I think he's trying to mock or to diminish her in front of the jury. Mr. Myers asked if the symptoms of decompression sickness would result in skin discoloration. And Professor Kinsey said it would not. Why would it not? Because there's no oxygen in it. So Professor Kinsey's understanding of this skin discoloration is because it's oxygen and not nitrogen, but that's not the case. The fact is that the bend, also decompression sickness, can cause skin discoloration, known as skin bends or cutaneous DSC, and it manifests, guess what, as mottled reddish-blue patches on the skin, often resembling a rash or marbled pattern. It is caused by the formation of inert gas bubbles within the skin and underlying tissues during or after a dive. So there is a condition that occurs alongside the bends, the general bends in the body, and it's called the skin bends, believe it or not. And you get a mottled or marble skin. It's well known that the bends can cause skin bends, which can cause skin discoloration, but Professor Kinsey says that's yes. Professor Kinsey says the problem with decompression syndrome in comparison to an embolism in infants is the bubbles get bigger as the deep-sea diver returns to the surface. Why are we talking about the bends? And why are we talking about the bends to someone who doesn't know anything about the bends? Mr. Myers says that the other limitation is the available medical literature for our emboli. I told you in the last episode, 8,499 papers I found on our emboli. Professor Kinsey says the reason that study was used in her report was that skin discoloration had been an observation in that study as it had been in cases for air embolism. We're all over the place now. Professor Kinsey says the scale of the air embolism problem would depend on the size of the air bubbles and the type of vessel that it's in. But Professor Kinsey also said she's not an expert on this thing, so really why should we pay any heed to what she says? So upon a question from the judge, Professor Kinsey says she's never encountered any discussion about nitrogen bubbles in the systems, other than in deep-sea divers. She says the biggest factor for any air embolism will be the size of the air bubble and the vessel that it's in. So she says that the biggest factors for any air embolism would be the size of the air and the vessel that it is, not that you can distinguish one from another. What was not a factor in her discussions was the quantities that made up the air, that is, the amount of nitrogen and the amount of oxygen, carbon dioxide, etc. No, that was not a factor in our discussion, but it should have been a factor in our discussion because, as I pointed out, it is impossible. 1 bit of oxygen, which would be the component of 5 mils of air given by Letby 10 or 15 minutes before Dr. J. Ram showed up, would still be present to cause pink flitting rashes. This is just the most outrageous bullshit. And the fact that it's in a murder trial is absolutely staggering to me. So to include all this briefly, Dr. J. Ram in 2015 said that he came across this 1989 paper. So Dr. J. Ram was the first person who said that Letby had created an air embolism. The 1989 paper is not sufficient to say that Letby caused an air embolism. Not at all. Despite what the appeal court judges might say that there was other evidence for air embolism, there wasn't any forensic evidence at all. There were no CT scans, there were no gas chromatographs, there were nothing. There were just the opinion of a guy looking at a 2D X-ray and then another guy looking at globule. If you check the literature yourself, you will see that that's not sufficient to prove that there's an error. And then in 2017, Mara Reedes does a review of this case. So we're very, very early into Operation Hummingbird. And he says that there's no convincing evidence that death was caused by anything other than natural causes. Then we have Dr. Evans coming in, and Dr. Evans saying that he reached the conclusion, independent of everyone else, that an air embolism was the cause of death. Then we have Dr. Bowen agreeing with Dr. Evans, and we have Professor Kinsey agreeing with Dr. Bowen and Dr. Evans based on this skin discoloration. It's not based on anything else. Professor Kinsey said it was very impactful, the skin discoloration. And we have to remind ourselves again, the skin discoloration was never recorded at the time. It was given in a police interview 2.5 years later. Is this the standard of evidence that is sufficient to jail someone for murder in the United Kingdom? I find it very distressing, all of this stuff. We're finishing off with BBA now. People are free to do their own research. People are free to just Google any of the things that I've said. Google air embolism, look at cases of air embolism, do whatever you like, but you won't find anything remotely like this. This is a unique clinical presentation, and this clinical presentation would not have been given to doctors as a convincing proof of air embolism and skin discoloration and all that kind of stuff. It's just all utter nonsense. We'll finish it there, and we'll see you in the next episode. Or we're going to take a little deviation and look at a podcast from YouTube called Courtroom 2, which I just came across. We'll see you then. Bye.